In tribal cultural competency trainings, oftentimes it's important to understand the role of history in tribal government and community relations. It is especially important when we think about the discussion of history within the tribal classroom. To be upfront, the conversation related to history in many Native Americans' experiences has been guided by an ethnocentric conversation about history, one of it being guided primarily by the West's understanding of world history, usually within a Judeo-Christian setting. When we think about contemporary history in a chronological sense from the Western perspective, we will usually start with the founding of this country, the developments of the Constitution, the implementation of various governmental programs related to how our country became what it is today. There are also cultural and social contexts for understanding our history, oftentimes related to things like the celebration of 4th of July, or perhaps Christmas, or perhaps the Easter celebrations, etc. When we think about history within Native American concepts, not only are we understanding that there is this Western history that's running parallel to our cultural indigenous histories, we also understand that there is a much larger conversation related to history from the indigenous or tribal cultural perspective. And so when we talk about history in tribal communities and within our families, oftentimes the beginning of that conversation is the creation stories. By creation stories, I mean how the world was created based upon our Pueblo or Apache or Navajo cultural understandings. They usually begin with the beginning of the world, oftentimes similar to the conversation related to the book of Genesis. The differences are going to be quite stark. For example, how animal beings were created, the role and the presence of various deities related to the natural world, the interactions, and then eventually the creation of human beings in the context of the creation of the world, as well as the interactions of the deities, the animal beings, and human beings. And so from these creation stories, we have a very intimate understanding of how our tribal homelands came to be. They inform the important relationships that we have as tribal members to the environment around us. Mountains aren't just mountains. In our view, as tribal people, mountains have an origin or a creation story. Related to those creation stories are deities that are placed in those mountains, the animal beings that are placed in those mountains, and the religious, cultural, ceremonial functions they play within the context of how the world was created. It should also be noted that there is not just one world in the creation stories. There are multiple worlds in which the deities, the animal beings, and human beings traversed, usually because of conflict in the previous worlds. And so right now, from a Navajo perspective, as an example, we are in the fourth world. And in this fourth world, obviously, if you take a look around, there are multiple different people. There are the animal beings, and there is the creation of what we call the reality of this world. And so when we try to understand the role of creation stories with our contemporary existence, we oftentimes reflect back, tell stories, acknowledge through ceremonial practices or religious traditions why this world is such. So from the historical creation stories, we understand that there is a sacred cultural relationship to this world that is also based on where we came from in previous worlds. And so when we think about the uniqueness of the creation stories and of indigenous histories, oftentimes we run into conflict with how the West understands history and the creation of the world, oftentimes from the historical experiences and sometimes defined by scientific observations from the Western perspective. Now, where those places come into conflict might be an understanding of how the sun evolves around the earth, for example, or how we interact with one another as human beings from a historical perspective. Here's an example, the Bering Strait theory. Western perspectives articulate that America was populated or peopled by the Bering Strait, people coming over to Bering Strait. From a cultural, historical, or indigenous historical perspective, there was no Bering Strait. We have always been here. How we came to be here are from the previous worlds, 1, 2, and 3, and eventually 4th worlds. And the conflicts that were a part of who we were in those previous worlds, and the cultural and religious understandings of how we traversed each of those worlds to become essentially better human beings. And so when we compare the Bering Strait theory with the indigenous understanding, in this example from the Navajo creation stories, we see that there is a conflict between an understanding of history. It's important to know that history sometimes can be conflict-laden conversation. And it's also important to know that it requires a certain sensitivity and open-mindedness when you begin talking about history within tribal communities, especially related to the creation of the world, because multiple cultures have different understandings of how we came to be. Native, indigenous cultural understandings of history and the creation stories help inform who we are today.